If you have been paying attention at all, you are aware that one of the most interesting, controversial public debates involving religion is that of intelligent design. Some years ago, a group of distinguished scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers dared suggest that God's hand might be discernible in science, that design might be discernible in science and might in fact be a helpful scientific category, and moreover, it might even be appropriate to teach this as an alternative model in the public schools. Outrage all around was the reaction in the secular scientific and academic community. One of the leading spokesmen of this movement is William Dembski, who we have with us today, author of the groundbreaking book, The Design Inference, Eliminating Chance Through Small Probabilities, published by Cambridge Press in 1998. Currently, he is research professor of philosophy at Southwestern Baptist and a senior fellow of the Discovery Institute in Seattle. Now, Bill is well prepared to talk about various subject matters, given his educational pedigree. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He also has a PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago. He has an MDiv degree in divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary. Started slacking off there, Bill. I know PhD in theology, you know. Seriously, what a slacker.
My wife won't allow it.
Your wife won't allow it, okay.
So
we'll accept that. But you were going to do it otherwise, okay. Okay. But Bill's work has gotten lots of attention. He's been interviewed for numerous magazine articles. 3 front-page stories on the New York Times have involved his work. Time magazine also did a cover story on intelligent design, which quoted and cited him, interviewed by various television stations and the like. And we're delighted to have him here today to discuss with us this crucial and important issue. Dr. Dembski.
Thank you. Well, it's a delight to be with you. A real blessing for me. This seminary, this is my first time here, but I've heard so much about what God has done here over the years, and so it's a real pleasure. God has blessed this place. I count it as one of the great seminaries in the world, so thank you for letting me be here with you. I want to start with a verse of Scripture that's tucked between 2 much better-known verses of Scripture. It's John 3:12. Preceding that, we have Nicodemus going to Jesus and saying, you must be a teacher of God. How do you do all this great stuff? And then Jesus gets right to the point, you must be born again. And then a few verses later, we have, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. But right in the midst there, Jesus is responding to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is puzzled by all of this, and then Jesus, instead of building his self-esteem, says, why don't you understand this? And then Jesus says, and this is the punchline, this is the verse I want to focus on, verse 12 in John 3, if I have told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you heavenly things? And so here we see earthly things and heavenly things being contrasted, and there's, as it were, a logic. If you don't grasp what's going on with the earthly things, you're going to miss out on the heavenly things. And we have these sorts of distinctions in theology: general revelation, special revelation, natural history, sacred history, the law of creation, the law of redemption, natural law, and then God's law as given in the covenant. And so we have these sorts of distinctions, and yet there seems to be a tight connection. The God whom we serve is the God who created the world and is also the God who saves us in Jesus Christ. And so there are these connections, and Jesus here seems to be saying that you have to grasp something about the earthly if you're going to have a window, if you will, into the heavenly. And it seems then, correlatively, if you miss it, if you don't understand things about the physical world aright, the world that God has created, that you might miss some things about the heavenly world. So with that as a preamble, let me get into my story, and I'm going to back up about 27 years now, I think it is. I was on the streets of Chicago, a fairly new Christian, and I was street witnessing with some friends of mine. And we were in the Newtown area around Clark and Fullerton, if that means anything to you. And we met two young fellows, and we started engaging them about the claims of Christ. And the thing is, these fellows, they were in the early 20s, and they were drunk. They had been drinking too much, and as we started talking to them, at first they were ridiculing, laughing at us, but then they actually started crying. They started weeping. Weeping may be too strong, but they were crying. And what they said over and over again was, "We wish we could believe the way you do, but we can't any longer. We wish we could believe the way you do, but we can't any longer." And it turns out that they had been Wheaton College students. They'd graduated from Wheaton and then gone down to one of the 8 or so seminaries on the University of Chicago campus, and very quickly their faith had eroded. And so the question that, that whole incident is burned in my memory, but the question that arises is, well, what did they learn that prevented them from believing, as I and my naive fellow witnessers were believing? Here we were, these new Christians. We took the Bible at face value. We're believing it, talking about Jesus, and suddenly that no longer had any traction with these fellows. So what had they learned? Well, about 14 years later, I went to Princeton Seminary, and I think I got a sense of what they had learned. And I think two things that you get very quickly at seminary, at a mainline seminary that doesn't value the Christian tradition and orthodoxy as much as they should, is the biblical criticism, but a biblical criticism that accepts really a materialistic way of looking at the world. So I would say in addition to the biblical criticism, you imbibe what may be called a scientific materialism. Now, usually it's not the full scientific materialism of a Richard Dawkins, but still a sense that the way the world is constituted, there isn't really much room or play for God to get in there, to get the divine finger in there, to do much of any consequence. And so what quickly happens is miracles of the Scripture, part of sacred history, get thrown by the wayside. And so to this day, there are lots of my seminary professors at Princeton that I don't know where they stand on the resurrection. I assume that they don't believe it. And then a belief that a material process brought us into being. God may have had something to do with that process, but it's not discernible in any way, at least not any rational or scientific way, that God had anything to do with it. And if you're an atheist and take that as an atheistic account of the world, well, that's rationally defensible as well. And so somebody like Richard Dawkins can then say that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So you get a worldview, a conception of nature that really doesn't have much room for any sort of design, divine role, intelligence, purpose. Now, how did this happen? And is this a new phenomenon on the intellectual scene that we look at the world and it becomes opaque to the divine wisdom? And I would say this is really not a new thing. I mean, I would say if we go back in ancient religious traditions as well as ancient philosophical traditions, we see this same sort of divide. Is the world fundamentally an act of mind, intelligence with purpose, or is the world an outworking of brute material forces that over time lead to intelligent beings like ourselves? In a sense, intelligence becomes a byproduct of these brute material processes. And which is it? And how could we decide? But just to give you a sense, though, that this is an ancient conflict and controversy, not something that's just the latest flash in the pan, think of some of the ancient religious literature, creation stories. We have, with the Hebrew story in Genesis, we see God bringing the world into being and then organizing the world with a spoken word. And the sense of a mind-first world where a god or gods create the world, bring it into being, and then organize it, arrange it for purposes. You find that in other creation accounts. There's a Memphite theology in ancient Egypt, which takes a similar approach. But you also have other religious traditions in which mindless material processes really start things off. You think of the Babylonian creation myths. Tiamat and Apsu, sweet and salt waters churning around. They give rise to one generation of gods, and these give rise to another generation of gods, and eventually you get to Marduk, the prince of the gods. But notice, the gods are getting better. They're evolving, they're progressing, and so Marduk becomes the chief of the gods. Similarly, in ancient Greek mythology, you have natural forces, Gaia and Uranus. They start things off, and you get a generation of gods, the Titans. You get another generation. You get to finally Zeus and the gods that inhabit Mount Olympus. So it's again this progression from material forces to these gods of increasing intelligence and power. Philosophical traditions, if you go back to ancient Greece, even among certainly the Socratic, but pre-Socratic philosophers, you've got people who hold to a mind-first world. Plato, certainly, with his world of ideas. Among pre-Socratics, Anaxagoras stands out. But then you also have materialistic philosophers, Democritus, Leucippus, and Epicurus. And I want to focus a little bit on Epicurus because I think he provides an interesting insight into the contemporary scientific materialism. Epicurus, when we hear of Epicurus, we often think of Epicurean, hedonism, a life of pleasure. And there was that in Epicurus, but the thing is, if you have the picture of Hugh Hefner when you think of Epicurus, you're way off the mark. Epicurus, his big deal was tranquility. He wanted a peaceful life. And he found that to have a peaceful life, and by the way, he was abstemious. He didn't water and barley. That's what he wanted, a very simple life, because if you ate too much, you could get indigestion. That would upset your peace and tranquility. Well, there are two things that he needed, though, if you will, metaphysically, to have a peaceful life. One, if there were gods or a god that could intervene, do miraculous things in the physical world, that could mess up your day, because you're going along, you've got some plans, God gets in there and does something capricious, and suddenly your peace is gone. Now, the other thing that could really undermine your peace is if you had to face a god or gods in an afterlife who might hold you accountable for your deeds in this life. Because then you'd be worried, well, did I displease this God, about how I'm living my life? So what he wanted then was a world in which gods could not intervene, so a caused causal universe, and then no afterlife in which there was a God to be accountable to. This should sound very familiar, especially with the recent spate of atheists, and when you try to think of what perhaps are some of the motivations there. These people do not want there to be a God. So these were his desiderata. This is what he wanted. How was he going to get there? Well, he concocted a physics or a natural science or natural philosophy to make that possible. And it was a materialistic worldview. It was basically saying the world is constituted of material particles. They move around, they organize themselves, and I happen to be organized one particular configuration, so are you. Matter has to be organized in particular ways to be human. But when we die, that matter disintegrates, and then we become worm food, and that's it. And so that was his conception of the world and reality. And it gave, if you will, sustenance to this these desires of his for peace and tranquility. Now, Epicurus has actually cast a long shadow. He's not perhaps a household name, but he's cast a long shadow, and he's been deeply influential in the history of philosophy and even science. I mean, his ideas have been there in the background. But I think we do have a new development these days as follows. I mean, Epicurus had certain things that he desired, and then he built a science to justify it. Well, in our day, what has happened is science is supposed to actually, the evidence of science is supposed to show that the world is this self-contained account. It's not that we have this metaphysical view that we're just trying to justify. It's that science on its own terms is supposed to be showing that there is no need for any sort of intelligence or design or purpose behind the world. Now, how did we get there? I mean, I gave you the quote of Richard Dawkins, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Well, I think a lot does center on Darwin. So let's back up just a little bit and where we were before Darwin. This talk is titled Intelligent Design, Yesterday's Orthodoxy, Today's Heresy. Well, a mind-first view of the universe and the world was very common, certainly throughout, I would say, the first 1800 years since the time of Christ. I mean, this was the dominant conception of the world. And I think in a sense, we come to the flowering fruition of that thinking in terms of how God's handiwork is worked out in the world in the natural theologian William Paley. And so in 1802, he writes a book called Natural Theology, subtitled Evidences for the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. Now these old titles, they were often a mouthful, but they told you exactly what the book was about. Okay, so evidences, he's looking for evidence in the world for the existence and attributes of the deity. So he's going to show that God exists, and not just that God exists, but what type of God exists. One that's omnipotent, has all these perfections that are commonly attributed to God. And where's he going to derive that evidence? From the appearances of nature. Evidences for the existence and attributes of the deity collected from the appearances of nature. So what's he looking at? Well, for Paley, he looked at, if you have any familiarity with him, you've no doubt heard of his famous watchmaker argument. He describes going into a heath or a field, finding a rock there and saying, well, that rock, for all I know, could have been there forever. But if he finds a watch there, the way those parts are adjusted for the end of telling time, this adaptation of means to ends, which gives clear sign of purpose, that shows Paley that here is something that's designed, that could not always have been there, that is the work of an intelligence. Okay? Now that, in its time, even in the early 1800s, was still a compelling argument for most people. Now, what happened to that argument? Well, even prior to it, there had been some rumblings, and let me try to sketch for you the logic which took people away from this design point of view. Okay, so who made the watch? Or in case it wasn't not so much the watch, but things that are equivalent to the watch in nature, like human beings, eyeballs, the universe as a whole with its marvelous structuring. Well, where did that come from? Well, Paley was clearly trying to argue that God was responsible for this. Well, what did God do? How did he bring this all about? Well, when you start making God the designer behind things like a clockwork universe, if you push this metaphor of the clock too far, what you find is that this whole design program starts coming apart, because then you start asking yourself, well, what's the best watch you could make? Well, the best watch you could make is one that never needs winding, right? I mean, why have a watch that you constantly have to be adjusting if you can make one that doesn't need winding? So the best watch would be one that never needs winding. Well, quickly you find that from a God that's engaged in the world in real time, you have a God that moves away from real time, that just sets it all up and then lets the clock run. So you go from theism very quickly to deism. But then you could ask also, well, okay, so God made this whole watch of the universe and the various parts of it, but, in our experience, watches don't just magically materialize, they come about by other things moving the parts that become the watch. Well, why can't just God make the world to make itself? In fact, there was a children's book called The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley, where instead of God making things, the implication was that God makes things to make themselves. Okay, and so then you get a completely self-organizing world where, in a sense, God is even pushed further away. But if you have a world that's in itself, in a sense, completely self-organizing, explains itself, what need for God? And so what you find is, for instance, with contemporary Darwinists like Francisco Ayala, formerly a Catholic priest, he'll say that Darwin's great achievement was to show that the creative organization of living things could be achieved without the need for a designer or creator. Okay, it's not that a designer or creator doesn't necessarily exist. It's just that there's no need for a designer or creator to exist. Science has dispensed with him. And that's supposed to be the great selling point of Darwin's theory, is his view that natural selection and random variations, this purely material process, can account for all that we see in biology. And if we can't see design in biological systems, well, where can we see it? And so that's the implication. And so somebody like Richard Dawkins will say that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Okay, well, where do we go from here then? I mean, is it that as Christians we just sit back and say, well, I guess science has shown that God's handiwork is not at all evident scientifically, so maybe as just a pure faith move, I might say, well, but I still believe God did it. God set up the whole thing that way. God uses natural selection and random variation as the means of his, to bring about all this biological complexity and diversity. Now, that's a possibility. I think there's an uneasy wedding of Darwinism and Christianity. There are people who do it. I think perhaps the most notable one is, in recent times, is Francis Collins, who thinks that Darwin basically hit the nail on the head, and that, in terms of the science, but that God still is behind all of this and working his purposes through this process. Well, that may be, and I think theological sophistication, what it is, we can often take things that seem quite disparate and put them together and have an uneasy marriage. I mean, there are lots of uneasy marriages out there. But I think the deeper question is whether, in fact, Darwin explained what he purported to explain. I'll be saying more about that actually in a lecture I'm giving tonight and then tomorrow. But I want to say a little bit then about intelligent design and what it brings to the party, why we shouldn't accept this Darwinian view, that we should, in fact, think that there is something more than just blind material processes, at least as far as what we can determine scientifically. So let me give you then what intelligent design is. I mean, what we had, I would say, in the past with something like Paley is we had some intuitions about design. We had some systems that seemed to, were analogous to design systems. You look at an eyeball, I mean, it's similar to a camera. We've invented cameras. Well, it's couldn't the eye be designed? But what we, I think, lacked really with somebody like Paley were some precise methods for detecting design in these systems, and then trying to come to terms with the actual design features and what and being able to do science, get scientific insights into these systems. So let me just describe then briefly what intelligent design is, and I think it'll be useful also to distinguish it with some of the other ideas out there, because intelligent design, I think, is often confused with, on the one hand, natural theology, and on the other, with creationism. Simplest definition of intelligent design that I know is the following: the study of patterns in nature that are best explained as the result of intelligence. Let me give you that again. The study of patterns in nature that are best explained as the result of intelligence. Now, seen in that broad sense, I mean, there are many special sciences that already fall under intelligent design. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is that signal from outer space that we're getting? Is that a naturally formed signal, or is it an intelligently formed signal, one sent to us by an alien intelligence? And the thing is, our very language and making sense of the world really divides along those lines. Is it accidental, random, the result of chance, or is it the result of purpose, intention, intelligence, design? If you saw the movie Contact, this is about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. There's a key moment where contact is established with an alien intelligence, and at that moment, one of the radio astronomers turns to a Jodie Foster character and says, "This isn't noise, this has structure." Okay, noise, structure, drawing those distinctions. Well, a lot of my work is focused on uncovering and developing, describing in precise, logical, mathematical terms, techniques for design detection. And then the question becomes, well, what happens if we take those techniques, which are used in various special sciences like search for extraterrestrial intelligence, forensics, archaeology, cryptography, various disciplines like that, and focus them on biological systems? Well, what if these methods tell us that these systems are, in fact, designed? Okay, now, if I had just written my book, The Design Inference, and not taken it that far, I'd probably be a well-employed philosopher these days at a secular university. But as it is, because I decided to take these methods and apply them to biology, things just got out of hand. Controversy bloomed. So why? Well, very quickly, this forces some deep worldview metaphysical issues, because search for extraterrestrial intelligence. If we find an alien intelligence, materialistic scientists could say, yeah, but that alien intelligence evolved the same way that we did, by material processes, no problem. Archaeology, we find something that looks like an arrowhead. Well, that was a human designer. But if there's design in biology, who or what could that designer be? Panspermia, aliens directed panspermia. Spaceships came to Earth and seeded it with life from outer space. Well, I mean, that view has actually been taken seriously, and that still falls within a materialistic science, because those space aliens presumably would have evolved on some planet where it was more likely for things to evolve than on planet Earth. But that just pushes the problem further back, and our best science is telling us that the world has not existed forever. So we've only got at most a few billion years for life in the universe to come into a place where it could be habitable and permit intelligent organisms like ourselves. So if there's an intelligence behind us and life on Earth, it would have to be an unevolved intelligence. And that would mean that a purely materialistic account of our being here was false. That it would point to a mind-first world as opposed to a matter-first world. So you see, I mean, there's some very fundamental worldview distinctions going on here. Now let me say a little something about how intelligent design is different from natural theology as classically conceived, and then also creationism. Natural theology, I gave you that subtitle from Paley. He was trying to go from the data of nature to the transcendent, personal creator God of Christianity. I mean, he was trying to go from the data of nature all the way to this God. And the thing is, there's no logical train by which you can get that far. I mean, if you're looking at patterns in nature, as intelligent design is, those patterns are going to be instantiated in finite material objects. How are you going to get to an infinite personal God by looking at finite material objects? I think what you can do by looking at complexity that we find in biological systems is say that whatever the intelligence is that's behind this it's a highly skilled nano-engineer. Okay, well, that's fine as far as it goes, but the Christian God is certainly a highly skilled nano-engineer, but also more than that. A lot more than that. And so the problem is these design inferences that we are drawing within the theory of intelligent design are limited in terms of how far they go. They don't get you to a full-fledged theology. They get you to an intelligence behind the world. As a Christian, I can then say that the intelligence that's ultimately behind that is the God that I serve. But that is a theological move that I make. It's not that I can go from the data of nature all the way to this God. And I think that's actually very good and healthy, because I mean, one thing it tells you is that intelligent design is not the gospel. I mean, it's only getting you so far. You're going to have to bring theological resources to bear to make sense out of this then theologically. Well, how about creation and creationism? Well, creation is always a doctrine of where did everything come from, at least in the first instance, the ultimate source of things. And then also, certainly within the Christian doctrine of creation, that God is then also organizing the world, taking responsibility not just for things coming into being, but then also their outworking and how the world is organized. Now, that is different from a design view. Design is much more, let's go back to that definition, patterns in nature. It's those patterns that are in, if you will, pre-existing stuff. A carpenter is a designer. A carpenter takes wood, various materials, and fashions it into some structure that's designed. But the carpenter is not responsible for where that wood came from in the first place. Doctrine of creation would be more akin to, well, where did all that stuff come from, which was then fashioned? Okay, so design is different from a doctrine of creation. It's consistent with it, but there's a difference there. And so you could find, for instance, Aristotle, Stoic philosophy, there are lots of philosophical traditions that would be open to design, which do not hold, though, to a doctrine of creation. Now, what about creationism? Creationism, isms always, cast a pall over whatever they're attached to. But so creationism, usually what's referred to there is some sort of harmonization of the science of the day with a particular interpretation of Genesis. And there are a number of interpretations out there. There's a day-age view. There's a literal six-day creation view, which is very common. And all of those also would be compatible with intelligent design, but they go much further. They will make specific claims about the world, its age, how God interacted, the connections, evolutionary connections or absence of those between various organisms, which intelligent design just by itself would not get into. So in a sense, intelligent design is much more minimalist. It's not making anywhere near as broad or far-reaching claims as a doctrine of creation or a version of creationism. And yet, it seems to get right at the hub of where so much of the controversy over the existence of God, God's role in society, is focused these days. Because it does seem to get at this, it does get at this fundamental question of, is this a mind-first world, or is it a world in which material is fundamental, and mind intelligence is then an outworking of material processes? So basically, take the laws of physics and chemistry, run them through history, and you get mind, but you don't have mind starting it off. And if you don't have mind starting it off, there's no ultimate purpose. No purpose for you, no meaning, ultimate meaning. It's what you construct. Okay, so that's, I'm trying to, in some sense, give you also a lay of the land. What are some of the issues there, and why there is so much controversy connected with this? Now, let's see, I'm getting close to the end. So what I'd like to do is try to put this in something of a theological context for you. And these are some thoughts that I've had recently on this. I've not written, most of what I've told you thus far I've written in various places, but this is something I haven't really developed that much. But I think it gets at the heart of perhaps why there is so much resistance to design in the academy these days. One thing which you find is, I mean, the sort of things that I'm telling you here about intelligent design, most of the American public finds this pretty congenial, okay? But if you go into the academy or among our media elite, it's resisted fiercely, okay? Gallup polls over the last 25 years consistently have shown that only about 10% of Americans believe in this sort of materialistic worldview and a materialistic account of evolution. Okay, so 90% are open to some form of intelligent design, and yet it seems that that 10% overwhelmingly rules the academy and the media and the public square. Okay, so how, so what is it that keeps this alive? I mean, why is this materialistic worldview so prevalent? I think to me, this is what I want to float by you and see if you think this resonates. And it seems that in a sense what we have going on is a modern version of what we might call Pelagianism. Pelagianism, does that ring any bells? I mean, this was a heresy, 4th century. Pelagius was going at it with Augustine. And what was the view there? Was that basically God gave us his word. We have everything we need to do our own salvation. Okay? We don't need a work of grace. Okay? Basically God's given us what we need, and we can live the good Christian life on our own strength. Okay? Now, that's a heresy, right? Because we need God's grace daily, hourly, every moment. We need the Holy Spirit working in our lives to affect God's purposes. Our nature, especially our fallen nature, is not adequate in and of itself to live the Christian life. Okay? Now, remember, I started this talk with the distinction between the heavenly and the earthly, natural history, salvation history, all these distinctions. Well, think of design. What is design? Okay? Aristotle made the point that he distinguished design from nature, and he said, if you have an acorn will grow into an oak tree by nature because it has what it needs internally to build an oak tree. But he says pieces of wood just lying there do not have what it takes in themselves to produce a ship. It takes an artisan, a designer. I mean, the word was techne there for art or design, to put those pieces of wood together to form a ship. Right? Pieces of wood do not have it in of themselves to organize themselves into a ship. Okay? So this is a fundamental distinction. What nature can do, what a designer can do. And the designer has to put that shape on those pieces. In a sense, design is a work of grace. Those pieces of wood do not have what it takes. Okay? So it seems to me that what we have, it's in so much of contemporary thinking, it's a desire that God not play any role, that the world, just as our own selves, in the Pelagian heresy, it was that we could do it all on ourselves. In a sense, the world can do it all by itself. And it's somehow unworthy of God to create a world in which he has to get in there and be actively involved in it and, as it were, do a work of grace in designing things. Okay? And so it seems to me that it's the same sort of impulse, and it's an impulse to push God out, to deny that he had a role in things, and it seems that the logical outworking is the sort of virulent atheism that we see these days, because even Darwin was not an atheist. I mean, he still held to some sort of deity behind things, but as God gets pushed further and further away, as it's not clear what God is doing in the world, I think a lot of people, especially scientists who spend their day in the labs, never see any need, any place for God's handiwork, think, well, what's the point? God doesn't exist at all. I think that's the logic. So there's no, it's not that there's a strict logic of entailment or something where basically you're forced to that conclusion. You can believe that there's no evidence of design in the world and still believe in God. But if there is, and you're an atheist or materialist, that becomes very threatening. I think that's what's really then underlying so much of the conflict that we see. So, what difference then does all this make? I mean, and If you have not understood these earthly things, how are you going to understand these heavenly things? Well, it seems that we do need to understand the world aright, the physical world. And if we miss it, if we make some fundamental errors there, that's going to have grave consequences for the faith and how the faith is understood and how it works itself out in the world and in culture. And it seems that is what has happened with a scientific materialism, a materialistic worldview that has looked to science and especially Darwinism to underwrite itself. And intelligent design is challenging that at a fundamental level, saying that there's good evidence to think that this is a mind-first world. So I think I'm close to being out of time, so I will leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and I hope I see you for some of the other lectures. Okay.